Greetings all, we're back. We're going to talk a little bit about reinforcement here. I'm going to cover all three of these chapters in one set of slides. It'll just make things go a little bit smoother. I'm only going to be talking about the stuff that I feel that needs more explanation, and I'm also going to kind of go quickly through some of these things, assuming that you've read the material, and hopefully that this can just kind of supplement that, supplement the readings that you have. So, of course, you've got your exams that are up that you should be using as well to help guide you in how to learn about this material, and then we'll talk later about more examples. So anyway, here we go, reinforcement. All right, first off, there's a couple of factors that we need to talk about with regard to reinforcement. And the first one is contingency. Right? Contingency is probably the biggest component involved in why reinforcement does what it does. In a nutshell, contingency is a rule. Okay? So if you do this, then something else is going to happen. Right? So if you engage in a behavior, then you get the reinforcer. Or you can't turn on the lights until you flip the light switch. So the lights coming on is contingent upon you flipping the light switch, right? Among other things, having electricity in the house and so on and so forth, right? But you get the idea. So contingency is the most important factor in reinforcement by far. I mean, there's no question that that is what the leading criteria is. And we could go into all the empirical research as to why that's the case, but ultimately contingency wins out over all the other ones about in terms of how to get it to work, and how this stuff happens and how behavior functions. If we engage in trying to reward something non-contingently, meaning we try to reinforce something non-contingently, we're not really doing reinforcement. Your book does talk about non-contingent reinforcement. It's an odd area to talk about because part of the definition of reinforcement involves the concept of contingency. So you run into a logical problem to say there's such a thing as non-contingent reinforcement. It's out there. We use it as a procedure, and your book goes over some of the details about how and why that word and how and why we use it. But basically, it's along the lines of just kind of reinforcing anything that's happening at a given moment, and then we go from there. So we'll deal with that one later, though, and that's something that you can bring up questions on about how and why we use non-contingent reinforcement. So contingency, again, the big focus here is that the behavior happens first. You cannot reinforce behavior that hasn't happened. So in other words, I can't tell you good job for something that you're going to do tomorrow. It's not a reinforcer then. You can say it, but it's not going to strengthen the behavior. It's not going to do anything with regard to that behavior. So it's always about making that behavior more likely to occur in the future, which implies, as part of the definition, that you need to have the behavior happen first before you can reinforce it. That way you can increase the probability of it happening in the future. However, contiguity does play a role. Contiguity is closeness in space or time, right? So we do also know that immediate reinforcement is way, way, way more effective than delayed reinforcement. But it's not the only criteria, right? You still have to have this contingency. So contingency and contiguity, when put together, really explain what's going on with reinforcement and how it functions. Specifically speaking, the idea here with contiguity is that, again, the quicker you can reinforce somebody, the better off you're going to be, the more likely you're going to strengthen that behavior. If you think about it from a simple organism perspective, not a human one, because humans, we get the ability for rule-following behavior and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you think about it with simple organisms, the idea is that you're building a connection between the behavior that you as an organism engage in and the outcome or the consequence that produces in your environment. If it produces a consequence that's reinforcing, you're more likely to do it again. That's the nature of reinforcement, right? So the quicker you can make that connection, right, the clearer you can make it, the more likely you are going to get reinforced for it. The more likely that your behavior is going to increase, and it's going to increase quicker, right? So reinforce immediately if at all possible. In the real world, there's lots of delayed reinforcers. For example, saving money, is a delayed reinforcer. That's a challenging behavior. In fact, it's a self-management problem, and we'll probably talk about it later in the course with regards to self-management issues. But the idea being that if I save money now, I'm not really coming in contact with an immediate reinforcer. Sure, I get to see my bank account go up, but the real reinforcer for saving money now is a negative reinforcer. You avoid being caught off guard down the road when you need to spend money, like your water heater goes out or something like that, whatever, right? So if you get if you haven't saved up enough money, you can't replace that $1,000 item in the house, then now you're in a difficult scenario. But if you save money for, put away 10% of your paycheck every time or something like that, and then you've got this pad of money sitting there, the end result becomes that down the road, when the water heater breaks, the furnace breaks, or something like that, you then have the money to provide the item, and you're now getting your reinforcer for the money-saving behavior. So in reality, it becomes a negative reinforcement situation. You're avoiding that problem that could happen simply by saving your money, right? And then so it is delayed, and it will work. The problem is you have to come into contact with the contingency. So you got to save money for long enough until it's needed, and the moment it's needed, it will reinforce the money-saving behavior, guaranteed, and it's pretty much a given. And this is one of the things that is challenging to teach people about how to save money or do anything that has these long-term sort of reinforcers to them, is because there is no immediate reinforcement. It's very difficult to keep that behavior going simply because there's no reinforcement available until much later. So it's a challenge, but so we always try to maximize contiguity or minimize contiguity by saying that we want that as close as in space or time as possible. So deliver that reinforcer immediately if at all possible. And there's some good videos that I've posted in the course that talk about immediate, that kind of show that immediate reinforcement stuff. And you can take a look at those, and we can get our own comments about it. All right, rule following. I kind of mentioned it already. So contingency shaped and rule following. What's the difference, right? So people follow rules. Great, that's awesome. But why do you follow rules? And contingency shape, what do we mean by that? Right? So let's look at contingency shape first, and then we'll get into the rule following so we can identify the difference. The idea with contingency shaped behaviors, this is behavior that's come into contact with the contingencies. In other words, the reinforcing and the punishing scenarios in the world, right? So the behavior that has been contingency shaped, what you have experienced, you've come into direct contact with the consequences, and those have influenced your behavior accordingly, right? That's contingency shaped behavior. That's the behavior we always want, really. We always want contingency shaped behavior ultimately, and we'll always shoot for that ultimately. But in the meantime, we tend to do rule following behavior, which, by the way, if you'll notice what I just said, I didn't call it just rule following. I called it rule following behavior. Right? So don't forget that rule following, or following the rules, is a behavior in and to itself that needs to be explained. It is not automatic. Rule following is a behavior. How is that behavior shaped? It's contingency shaped. So you learn to follow the rules by direct contact with the contingencies. Once you learn to follow rules, then a whole new world opens up. It's one of those cusp behaviors, right? So once you learn to follow rules, that opens up a whole new world for you in terms of how you can function in your environment. If you're not following rules, you're going to run into problems, right? You won't have access to certain reinforcers. Right, so what is rule following behavior? Rule following behavior is just that. You follow the rules, right? So somebody gives you a rule, then you tend to do the work. Well, what's the point of the rule, right? So the rule will get you to a reinforcer. So in other words, if I am engaging in a particular behavior, right, and I've never done it before, but I have a set of rules in front of me about how to do it, then I will follow those rules and hopefully come in contact with the reinforcer for engaging in the behavior. Right? Without those rules, I would have had to kind of discover my own way to do whatever it is that we're talking about. So let's put this in context of a real example so it makes some more sense. Right? Let's see what's the rule for using a hand plane. Let me see if I can come up with the rule here. Somebody once told it to me, and I've done it a lot now, so I don't really recall the rule specifically, so I'll get the idea. Push down. Right? So with one hand, you're going to push down. With the other hand, you're going to guide. And with your body, you're going to move. Right? You don't use a hand plane by moving your arms back and forth. You'll get tired too quickly. Right? So you actually move your entire body. So push down, guide, move forward. Right? And then repeat. So push down, guide, move forward, repeat. Right? So that's the rule. If I engage in that rule properly, right? If I do the work as I'm told to do it, the end result will be I have planed my wood. I'm using a hand plane. I've planed my wood, and it's functional. It is now flat. Right? Or there's an angle on it if I'm setting it up to do an angle. And there's other rules associated with hand planes. 25-degree bevel versus a 20-degree bevel. When do you use on the blade itself? When do you use one? When do you use the other? Those are rules, right? So before you learn to do it, somebody's saying, well, you should use a 25-degree bevel if you're going across end grain, which I think that's wrong, actually. I'd have to double check, but I don't do end grain work that much. So in fact, no, it is wrong. So you'd want to slice it. So you use a 20-degree bevel when you're going across end grain. Yes, okay. Why? Well, don't ask why, just do it. You find out that it works. Right? So if you follow the rules and you come into contact with the reinforcer that you were supposed to come into contact with, that not only reinforces the behavior you just did of like engaging in the particular task, it also reinforces rule following behavior. So if you learn that following the rules produces a desirable outcome, if you will, that's colloquial terms there. So if you've learned that following the rules will get you the reinforcer, then not only have you been that one behavior been strengthened, but also the rule following behavior has been strengthened. So somebody that follows the rules today, in their, let's say they're older, in their 20s or something, so somebody that follows their rules is, you can go back into their reinforcement history and probably see that they were reinforced for rule following behavior in the past. It's worked for them. But there's another side to this. If I follow the rules and the rules didn't work, now I just functionally punished rule-following behavior. Now we'll deal with that later, but in terms of punishment versus reinforcement. But the basic idea is if I get a load of reinforcers versus just a couple of punishers for the same behavior, I'm probably going to continue to do the rule-following behavior. So for the most time, following the rules works, so I'll continue to follow the rules. If most of the time rule-following doesn't work and I don't come into contact with the reinforcers, then I'll stop following the rules. I won't do it anymore. The behavior's going to go away. All right, so rule-following behavior is a very useful thing, and it's typically speaking only human, and it's not for any special reason other than the fact that humans are verbal. You could set up rules for a dog or pigeon or a cat or something like that if you wanted to. It would be a challenge to set up the rule, but you could make it work, I suppose. So rule-following behavior is typically something seen primarily in humans, and kids are good with it. Kids like to test the rules, right? That's the idea. Are the rules really there? Are they not working? The idea is their rule-following behavior is being contingency shaped. Okay? And then in the meantime, you're also shaping some other behaviors as you go along. So rule following is something that needs to be explained into itself. It's something that we have to try and teach people. And when somebody doesn't follow the rules, then they've learned that it's not necessarily effective to do so. So you ask the question, why did somebody not follow the rule? Why did following the rule not work for them? Well, maybe the recipe was wrong. Maybe there was an error, a typo or something, and you used, it was supposed to be 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and you used 1 tablespoon because there was a typo and they did a big T instead of a small t or something like that. In that case, the rule is wrong, and if you follow it directly, you're going to get punished, essentially. You're going to have a nasty product on the outset there, on the outcome there. But if the rule is correct and is correctly written and it gets you into contact with the reinforcer, then you're more likely to do it. So, for example, when I cook, the first time I try a new meal, I always follow the recipe as closely as I possibly can, unless I know that there's something extremely wrong with it. But so I follow the recipe because that's the rule. I try the product, try the food after it's been done. I like it and I don't like it, but almost always, what I find out is that if I follow the rules closely enough, I'll get at least a reasonable approximation of what the original cook had done, and I'll be able to decide whether or not I want to continue that recipe, or if I want to just discontinue it altogether or modify it a little bit to make it even better. So the idea is rule following gets you in contact with a particular reinforcer, which is, I produced this meal, and then after that you can start to tweak it a little bit, and then it becomes contingency shaped. Okay? So start out with following the rules about how to make a curry, contingency shape it up a little bit, and add some different spices as you go down the line, or remove some spices or change things up. So that's the idea, that we've got this rule following versus contingency shape. They do work together, but we do prefer to go the contingency shaped route, but rule following is a behavior in and to itself that will lead us eventually to contingency shaped behavior. All right, let's talk about circular arguments, because there's a ton of them, and this field is about getting rid of circular arguments and not creating them, so we got to deal with this. So right off the bat, learning disabilities in general are set up in a way, and they've been taught to you this way, by the way, for the most part, that they've been set up and taught to you in a way that's circular. Little Billy has a problem spelling, and has a problem on spelling. Well, why does little Billy have a problem on spelling? Because he has a learning disability. Why does he have a learning disability? Well, my gosh, can't you tell? It's the spelling problem. He can't spell, so he must have a learning disability. Why do you have a learning disability? You can't spell. Why you can't spell? You have a learning disability. Blah, blah, blah. It's a circle. You go in it forever and ever, and it never stops, and it's like, right? It doesn't get you anywhere. It provides no explanatory, it has no explanatory power. And logically and scientifically speaking, it's absolute garbage. Okay? And I'm not saying that learning disabilities are garbage. Right? What I'm saying is there's a behavioral deficit. That behavioral deficit can be caused by all sorts of things. Sometimes it's a TBI. Sometimes it's another biochemical thing. Sometimes it's purely biological. Maybe there's no ability to recognize the difference between a B and a D. Maybe there's problems with the rods and cones in the person. So there is that side of things. But there's also the other side of things, which is that just because you've created a term, all right, doesn't mean that that then explains the behavior. It's like, oh, dyslexia. That explains why they get everything backwards and forwards. No. The confusion there, meaning that the confusion that a dyslexic child experiences and displays by reversing letters and numbers and things like that, that is the problem. All right? So they reverse things. That's not caused by something called dyslexia. Dyslexia is a term that came from the description. So instead of saying this person engages in behaviors of reversing their letters and numbers on occasion, we just simply say the person is dyslexic. Dyslexia did not cause that. In fact, it's the other way around. They have those those behavioral problems, which we then label those behavioral problems as dyslexia. The same thing goes for ADD, ADHD. You cannot say that ADD, ADHD caused a behavioral problem. It's a logical impossibility. It is a failure of our system to accurately address the problems at hand, and to try to make it easier, we have labeled things, right? But then where the real problem comes in is that we then take those labels and turn them around and use them as a reason for why we engage in these particular types of behavior. ADD, ADHD did not cause a damn thing. ADD, ADHD is a label for a set of behaviors that you engage in. Now, you can look closely. If you look at the DSM and things like that, you'll see the behaviors listed that you need to do in order to be diagnosed with ADD, ADHD. The problem is that most of us, every average day Joes, tend to take the diagnosis as the explanation. That's not the case. The diagnosis is a 1 or 2 word term that allows you to express what the problem is without explaining it. That's the definition of a diagnosis here. We're not trying to explain what caused it. We're just saying, here's what it is. So don't get caught into the trap that says, oh, little Billy doesn't pay attention because he has ADD. Little Billy doesn't pay attention. Little Billy has ADD, has been diagnosed with ADD because he doesn't pay attention. There is no having it or not. It's a label for a class of behaviors. And the DSM is set up properly. The problem is we interpret the label as some real event. Now, some of you are probably going, oh, no, Ryan, you're full of crap. I can't believe you're saying that. Oh, I know about it. I know this. I've had all these classes on this stuff. And okay, you're right. You have had classes on this. You have learned that there is some biological stuff going on with children that have been diagnosed with ADD, ADHD. What you can't tell me is which came first. And what I'll do is I'll point you to the research and say, interesting that you bring up the biochemical argument, because yes, if I change certain chemicals in the brain, I can produce behavior that looks like ADD, ADHD type behaviors. But the other side of this coin is also true. I can also select for different behaviors that will then in turn cause changes in the brain chemistry. So it's a chicken or egg question. You can't tell me which came first because there's no answer right now. We do know that both happen. If I change the neurochemical neurotransmitter stuff, then the end result is going to be a change in behavior. That's a given. That's basic biology. But what we've also found is you can go the other direction with it. You can change the behavior, and you can take somebody that's completely normal functioning and doesn't have those deficits that may be associated with ADD, ADHD on a neurochemical level. You can change their behavior to select for ADD, ADHD behaviors, and their neurochemistry changes right along with it. So now all of a sudden you took a kid that was normal and converted them into somebody that has a neurological deficit, if you will. So you need to really think hard about some of this stuff and where it goes. And part of this issue is that our society has adopted a medical model of behavior problems, and that's an issue. It really is. And we can talk about that more at another time, but the idea is that this medical model is useful for certain things, it's not useful for others. One of the things it's not useful for is providing explanations. It gets you to treatment, and that's awesome, and that's one of the things I like about it. Get a label out there, start treating it, but don't forget, you're not treating the label, you need to treat the behaviors that created the label. All right? Some people like to argue that reinforcement is circular. Why? Because there's a certain circularity to it if you're not paying close attention. Why am I drinking a Diet Coke today? Well, I've been reinforced for it. How do you know I was reinforced for it? Because I'm drinking it today. That is a circular argument. However, I did not properly explain why I'm drinking Coke in this particular scenario. Okay, so we have to be cautious. It is because the reinforcer. Okay, here, let's back up here. It's not circular simply because the reinforcer, works because it strengthens behavior. In other words, we have to watch first. We know that if I add a reinforcer, something that is a real reinforcer, we've identified it as a reinforcer, then by definition it will have changed behavior. It is not a circular argument. Part of the reason is that we can generalize that reinforcer to other behaviors and then strengthen the behavior accordingly. But we don't know if the reinforcer will work until it already has. We have to wait to see the empirical side of it. We can't just guess. So sure, if we extrapolate a little bit, yes, I'm drinking Diet Coke because because I've been reinforced for it. That's what you would expect, right? Based on what we know about reinforcement. But did I do the experiment to find out why me, Ryan, is actually drinking a Diet Coke? No, I didn't. So do I know for sure that I've been reinforced for it? No, I don't. I can reasonably conclude that I have, but I don't have any direct evidence of it other than a generalization from other instances of reinforcement. Probably a fair, accurate generalization, but it doesn't make it perfectly right. So again, part of the key with reinforcement is that you have to wait until the behavior changes to find out if it was reinforcement. And that's also the part that makes it not circular. Forgot to put this up as I've been talking for the last 3 minutes. Anyway, so it's only called a reinforcer if it changes the behavior. If it doesn't change behavior, it's not a reinforcer. Circularity's gone. Okay. Whoa, stimulus control. All right. There's a bit of a misnomer here. I hate the fact that they call it stimulus control. Because it gets you to think that the stimulus is actually controlling your behavior. In reality, it's still the consequence that's controlling the behavior. It just does it in the particular context. You learn about that context. You learn about what that one or a small set of behaviors is likely to be reinforced in that context. Therefore, you engage in those behaviors, right? So an SD, a discriminative stimulus. This is the stimulus that is present, right? And that a particular behavior is going to result in a reinforcer, SR. So, in other words, let's think about how we define reinforcement, right? So, in this three-term contingency, what the consequence is a reinforcer, punisher, whatever. So, we're going to focus on the reinforcer side. So, in the three-term contingency, you engage in a particular behavior which exists in a context, in an environment, and then you get reinforced for that particular behavior. What you've told the organism, or told the person with the reinforcement, is that in this environment, behavior X, whatever X was, will earn a reinforcer. So that's what the discriminative stimulus, actually, that's the power of the discriminative stimulus, is it then is a signal. It's like, okay, guess what? Now that this signal is here, you can engage in behavior X, and you'll get a reinforcer for it. That's how it works. So the SD is literally just a signal to say, if you behave now, you're going to get a reinforcer. We call that stimulus control. It takes a while to develop stimulus control, by the way. It's not something that's instant. It's not one trial learning. It's dozens of trials or lots of experiences. Maybe some rule-following behavior there to where you follow the rules. That's the discriminative stimulus. So the rules themselves are the SD. You engage in the behavior, and you catch the reinforcer for those particular behaviors in the context of the rule, but also you're learning some other stuff in there, which hopefully will get you in touch with the direct contingency. Okay? So again, stimulus control is learning to behave in one way in one setting and a different way in a different setting. Just think going to grandma's house. You take the kids to grandma's house, one behavior is okay there, but it might not be okay at home. I used to get away with murder at my grandmother's house, right? Partially because she called me little fucker, and I could just kind of do whatever I wanted because she called me little fucker, and I was pissed about it. No, but ha 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 ha. Anyway, The point is that it's okay to do something at grandma's house that it may not be okay to do at home, and vice versa. Maybe there's stuff that's okay to do at home that's not okay to do at grandma's house. And I mean, even today, when I'm around my grandparents in their 90s, you know, I don't swear around my grandparents. I swear around you guys. I swear around my friends. I swear in other places, but I don't swear around my grandparents. Why? Stimulus control. I'm never going to earn a reinforcer for swearing in front of my grandparents. They'll get pissed. In fact, I'll get punished for it. They're even in their 90s, and grandma will still slap my fingers, right, with a ruler, right? She's a little slower now, and she doesn't hit as hard, but the point still comes across. So that's stimulus control. So you're learning what to do in one scenario and not in another. Red light, green light. You learn what to do in the presence of a red light. That's different than what you do in the presence of a green light, so on and so forth. Oh, to tie this in a little closer with school psych, just think about what do you call it? Substitute teacher, right? The kids know that one behaviors have been selected for in the presence of their normal teacher, and then all of a sudden you get a new sub in there, and they have no idea what's going to be okay and what's not. So guess what the kids do? They test. They find out what's okay, and by pushing a lot of buttons and typically being naughty and inappropriate and trying all sorts of things. So I think being a sub would be one of the hardest jobs in the school district, because you're always basically trying to set up this new stimulus control. That's kind of what you're always trying to do. You're always changing behavior to say, okay, in my presence, you're never going to get away with this. And I remember this as a kid. We used to say, oh, who's your sub? Who's your sub? And we knew after a while that, okay, with this sub, you can't get away with anything. With this one, you can. You know, that type of thing. So you learn that stimulus control for each scenario. This is called an S delta. This is signaling an absence of a stimulus. All right. So an absence of a stimulus basically results in no reinforcement. So so an S delta is signaling that in this particular scenario, a response is not going to get you reinforced. Right? You're not going to get any reinforcement for it. So sometimes people can become S deltas, like the substitute teacher, for example, could be an S delta. So for getting extra free time on the computer, let's say, maybe this new sub has no desire to allow any children extra time on the computer, so you're not going to get that reinforcer. It's not, no matter what you do, it's not going to show up, right? So that teacher then that sub then becomes an S delta, that you're not going to get reinforcement for a particular behavior. I can't come and help you out with a particular task in order to earn the reinforcer for it, because, well, you're never going to give it to me, right? It takes a while for S deltas to develop. But it's the other side of the discriminative stimulus, right? So the SD tells you that, okay, a behavior is going to get you reinforced. The S delta says a behavior is going to get you nothing right now. So don't bother engaging in it. Again, as I've already said, the discriminative stimulus simply signals that reinforcement is now available for a given response. If we think about this in terms of like a bus or something like that, so the reinforcer for waiting for the bus is getting on the bus. So you don't get to the bus stop 20 minutes early. You get there close to the time at which the reinforcer is going to be available. In other words, you go out to the bus stop a couple minutes beforehand. So the time is the discriminative stimulus for the behavior of waiting for the bus, and then that's reinforced by the bus showing up, which doesn't always happen, especially in the snow, or if you're not paying attention to the rules and you don't read the snow route, as I did last year and got buggered and missed the bus. Actually, it was the year before. But anyway, you get the idea. So, all right, there is another term to the three-term contingency. So I've kind of lied to you the whole time. It's a fourth term, so we now have a four-term contingency, and this is what most of us prefer to use today. And is the EO-AO stuff always happening? And I'll define EOs, AOs here in a second. But is that always happening? Maybe, maybe not. It can always be happening. It may always be happening. So we'll assume that it is, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, the three-term contingency works without this. This is just something. Motivating operations are just things that change the value of a reinforcer. Right? So we have to know that certain reinforcers are more or less. A given reinforcer functions all the time, right? But sometimes it's more valuable than at other times. Right? In other words, using motivating operations, we can simply change the frequency of a behavior that has been reinforced by particular stimuli. So if we change the value of the reinforcer, we're going to change the behavior that reinforcer is tied to. So, in other words, we can Without even with using the same reinforcer, we can bring behavior up and down. We can make it high frequency or low frequency or high frequency, and so on and so forth, just by changing some other stuff ahead of time that would directly affect that. So we have two types of motivating operations. One of them is called an establishing operation. So an establishing operation, literally by definition, means you are increasing the effectiveness of the reinforcer. You are establishing the effectiveness of that reinforcer. What's the easiest way to establish the effectiveness of a reinforcer? Deprive people of the reinforcer. So if I deprive you of something, it's going to be more valuable to you. That's all there is to it. If I deprive you of food, you're going to work harder for it. Right? If I deprive you of ice cream, you're going to work harder for ice cream in the future. So you want ice cream to be in reinforcer? Don't give it all the time. You want froyo to be in reinforcer? Don't give it all the time. You want something else to be in reinforcer? Limit access to it. Right? This works for stimuli, the food stimuli. It works for money. It works for basically any type of stimulus you want to play around with, even access to behavior. Right? So if I'm always going for a row out in the ocean here, it's not going to be as reinforcing as what it would be to me right now. Why? Because really, I think I would really enjoy being in the Caribbean right now, going for a row out in the ocean. That looks really nice, and that would probably be one hell of a reinforcer for me. I don't know, but because I'm not going to make a circular argument here, but it sure seems like it would be a hell of a reinforcer. Right? Why? Because I haven't done it very often. Right? In other words, I've been deprived. So the motivating operation, the EO here, has happened. I have been deprived of access to the lukewarm or the warm bathwater of the Caribbean for several years, and it is now probably a pretty solid reinforcer. Abolishing operations go the other way. Right? You're abolishing the effectiveness of a reinforcer. Usually this is done through satiation. So, satiation? Yeah, satiating. So you get somebody full of something. I give you ice cream all the time. The ice cream's no longer going to be that valuable to you. Why? Because you always have access to it. Right? It's same thing as going out in the ocean. If I've always got access to that, bath water out there, and I can go for a swim every morning, then it's not going to be that valuable of a reinforcer for me anymore. It's like, yeah, all right, go ahead. Yeah, you're going to give me a swim in the ocean? Cool. I can do that any time. Like, no big deal. Like, whatever, right? So you get that sort of whatever attitude out of an abolishing operation. And trust me, kids will respond to this accordingly. You'll know right off the bat. All right, so you can see what I've got here. This is the four-term contingency. This is where they fit in. I don't actually like this structure. This is the way we typically draw it. Sometimes I draw it a little differently, but this is the way it's supposed to go. Excuse me. You've got the EO-AO, or what's also known as the MO. That's in front of the discriminative stimulus. And then you get your response, then you get your reinforcer. Well, I like to draw it underneath and then put the arrow towards the reinforcer. Because EO-AOs, they do happen before you start the three-term contingency for a particular task, but they don't directly affect discriminative stimuli. They directly affect a reinforcer at the end of this chain. So maybe putting them out front is fine, but drawing a curved arrow over to the reinforcer is what you should do. So fine, leave them out here, but they affect the reinforcer, right? Which in turn affects discriminative stimuli and the response in the context of that SD, right? So you can see that this stuff is very tightly linked together. And it also, when you talk about it this way, it seems like it's happening on this sort of chain sort of level. And it is in a sense, but it's also happening concurrently with all the behaviors that you're engaging in at any given time. So it's not as regimented as the way it looks, and it's not as structured as the way it looks. It's a lot more, I don't want to say random because that's the wrong term, but it's a lot messier than this. This is if we're just looking at one behavior at a time. We don't engage in one behavior at a time. We engage in thousands of behaviors concurrently, and we're always operating under different three-term contingencies or four-term contingencies concurrently. So we're always operating under concurrent schedules of reinforcement. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Okie doke. Types of reinforcers. All sorts of ones. Edible reinforcers, sensory reinforcers. Think about some sensory reinforcers, right? This could be all sorts of things. It could be I don't know why that would be a reinforcer to you, but maybe it is. All right. Clicker training. Right? Clicker training is a sensory reinforcer. You teach the animal, or the kid for that matter, that the click is now a reinforcer. It means it becomes a conditioned reinforcer. So it's a sound. Okay? So That's a sensory thing. You can have the feeling ones, you know, your feeling. You could have taste. You could have smells. You could have all sorts. So any sense, those things can all be reinforcers. Again, these are probably all conditioned reinforcers, except for the edible ones. But you could establish them all. There's all sorts of things that, that are reinforcing. Tangible reinforcers, pretty straightforward. Things you can manipulate, right? These are real things, items, toys, stuff like that. Right? This is a hot topic. Okay, we could go back into the experimental literature here, and I can tell you right now, this PSYC principle really took reinforcement stuff and turned it on its ear. It's a whole different way of looking at things. PSYC argued through some very simple experimentation that a stimulus in itself is not a reinforcer. It's the activity that you're engaging in when you interact with that stimulus that is the reinforcer. Think about eating. It's not the candy itself that's the reinforcer. It's eating the candy that is the reinforcer. And PSYC actually demonstrated that pretty darn well. It's a little beyond the scope here to get into that, because that's that core stuff that we're not covering in this class. But the point being that, sure, edible reinforcers, sensory, tangible, all that works. Also, don't forget that activity works. So the PSYC principle is really simple. Low probability behavior can be reinforced by high probability behavior. So let's restate that. Getting you to engage in a behavior that is something you wouldn't normally do can be done by giving you access to something that you would normally do. Contingent access. So studying can be reinforced. Studying can be reinforced by access to a behavior that you would like to do all the time. Of course, that means that you have to withhold access to that other behavior in the meantime. Right? So let's say computer games. Right? So you got a kid in the classroom, you say, all right, you can use the computer only if you finish your math homework. Using the computer is a high probability behavior. If given an opportunity, the kid will engage in it. Low probability behavior is probably doing your math homework or math assignment. Right? If given the opportunity, they will avoid it. So you can then make access to the computer contingent upon completing the other behavior of doing the math assignment. That's the PSYC principle. PSYC took it a step further and applied it to every single reinforcer out there, but not needed. You can just stick with this level. The other part's a philosophical and an empirical argument that we'll deal with at a later time, that we can talk about in other scenarios and things. So but the field hasn't answered the question: is it all activity, or is it stimuli? Stimuli work, and there's no reason to think that they don't. It may be that the stimuli cause an activity, and that's what's really doing the reinforcing. But in reality, it's a kind of an academic question, not a functional one. So PSYC principle, very, very, very useful. How do you find out if a particular behavior is going to work for the PSYC principle? Really simple. Just observe what the kids would do in their free time. Anything that they're doing in their free time is something you can use to strengthen behavior of something that they wouldn't normally do in the free time. Playing video games, playing on the computer, going to recess, ride your bike, all that stuff. That is all. You use all those things in the PSYC principle. So access to high probability behavior is contingent upon doing low probability behavior. Social reinforcers, just access to people. That's a huge one. It's an unbelievably big reinforcer. This can be something as simple as recess. It can be something as simple as group work. Depending on how you do your group work, there could be some social reinforcers involved there. How do we identify these things? Ask. Make a simple choice. Or ask them, what do you prefer? Do you prefer vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream? Well, I really like ice cream in general. Yeah, well, what type do you prefer? Oh, I like vanilla. Okay, cool. Now you know that vanilla is probably at least something to give a shot as a reinforcer. Come up with a list. What are the things they like to do? Use the activity-based reinforcement, right? Use the PSYC principle. Ask people, what do they prefer? What do they like? All right. Other things you can do along these lines. Give them a list. Here's the things that I can provide. Okay? Choose from those. So, for example, you can say that, all right, engaging in getting all your homework done this week will earn you guys a surprise. Well, what's the surprise? Oh, you'll see at the end of the week. You're going to get a choice. Right? Oh, interesting. So the kids' ears kind of perk up, and then you don't even have to ask them. Now you've got a stack of things. Maybe some of them are pens, some of them are stickers, some of them are erasers, whatever. Could be goofy little things like that. And then you say, okay, everybody did a great job with their math assignments this week, so everybody gets to choose something from these things. So then the people get to choose their own reinforcers. Right? It's awesome. I mean, it's really simple. And the other thing that we know is that with choice, if you give people a choice between 4, 5, 10 reinforcers or whatever, or stimuli that may or may not be reinforcing, and we got to wait to find out, right? So if you give people a choice between these 10 stimuli, any one stimulus used by you arbitrarily may not serve as a reinforcer, but because you're giving the individual the choice of which one they want, it ends up as a reinforcer. Even though by itself it wouldn't have worked, it's the choice that set the occasion for that reinforcer to work, right? Which is an interesting, for that stimulus to become a reinforcer. Really interesting sort of thing, and it's been fairly well studied. And we do know that giving people the choice of the types of stimuli that they would like to get, or that they get as the result of engaging in a behavior, increases the probability that whatever they choose is actually going to be a reinforcer. Other things, so you can have them rank order this stuff. You know, what's your favorite? You know, here's 10 items, rank order. Which one's your favorite? Which one's your least favorite? You know, that type of thing. And then that can help you decide what's going to be a reinforcer, or what to use as a reinforcer with that particular kiddo. And don't forget the different strokes for different folks stuff, right? Just because one kid chose an eraser as a reinforcer doesn't mean the next kid's going to want it. You know, for whatever reason, I still like my Pink Panther erasers. I think they're awesome, and I've always got one laying around somewhere. And because as a kid, that used to be my reward. You know, my teacher's like, "Hey, you can get a new eraser." They did it for everybody in the classroom. So if everybody, you know, whoever engages in whatever behavior right now, you're going to earn you're going to earn a Pink Panther eraser. And my hand would shoot up, and I would answer the math question or whatever it was. Yay! I got my reinforcer. But for other people, they didn't give to. They didn't want the reinforcers. They wanted an art gum eraser. Right? So maybe that was a reinforcer for somebody else. So again, rank order this stuff to find out. You know, have the kids rank it, have the adults rank it. Whoever you're trying to reinforce, have them rank the things that they would like the most, and then you can choose from that. And that's likely going to be a reinforcer. Ask others. What seems to be reinforcing? What does this person seem to like to do? What do they like to get? What's their favorite toy? Do they like to manipulate something? Do they like to play with Legos? Do they like to use clay? You know, that type of stuff. So ask others. Pre-task choice. So again, this is similar to the choice stuff I was talking about earlier. Say, okay, you have a choice, and this can be used quite frequently with very young kids. It works with the pre-task choice works awesome with young kids, where you give them the option. Okay, you can choose to get this, or you can choose to get this. Which would you prefer? But you know that you have to engage in the behavior. So if you engage in the behavior, you can get this or this. Which one would you like? Well, I want the book. Okay, good. Now do your behavior, and you'll get your book. Okay? That type of thing, whatever that behavior may be. Free operant observation. So free operant observation, just watch and see what seems to be a reinforcer. Right? Just watching what they do. If given an opportunity to do anything they want, what are they going to do? What are they going to play with? What's the types of toys that they're playing with? Kids that like to build Legos would probably also like to play with clay. Why? Because you're shaping something, you're building something, you're making something out of something. Kids that like to draw would probably also like to paint. So you get the idea here. So you connect these things together and you find out what's that core aspect of the behavior. So those are some procedures. There's other procedures for how to identify reinforcers, and there's some fun ones in your book that I'm not going to cover in here because they're clearly presented. All right, so using reinforcement, how do we actually pull it off? Start simple. Don't create drama the moment you start trying to teach a new behavior by making them complete the entire behavior before they're successful. But before they earn a reinforcer. Give them lots of reinforcement early on. Just even getting close should earn a reinforcer. Why? Because you're going to shape the behavior. Right? So what's shaping? Shaping is defined as reinforcement of successive approximations of desired behavior. Let's do that again. Shaping is defined as the reinforcement of successive approximations of desired behavior. Meaning that the desired behavior in the picture here is surfing. So what's the trainer doing? He's shaping the response. The first things first, learn to lay on the surfboard. And he said, good job, good job. He's doing some minor corrections there, right? Getting the arms in the right position, so on and so forth, making sure you don't look like a beached whale or whatever, or not a beached whale, but you get the idea. So making sure that you engage in the proper behavior, and he's giving you lots of reinforcers early on. Good job, well done. All right, you're laying on there right. That's not surfing, but he's giving reinforcers for a behavior that's going to eventually become surfing. Right? The next step is, this guy is not going to give you a reinforcer for just laying on the board. He's going to give you a reinforcer for modeling what you do in terms of a transition between paddling out and then turning around and getting up on a wave. So now the next step is going to be, what's that next procedure, right? What's that next behavior that you need to do? So if we're going to be involved in shaping, you're no longer earning reinforcers just for learning how to paddle. You're earning reinforcers for getting your knees up on the board, or whatever it may be, right? Or getting up on your feet or something like that. So then the next step is, all right, how do you control the board? Then the next step is actually going out and trying this in the surf, and you provide access to, you try each one of these. So ultimately the idea is, with shaping, you're slowly getting to that end goal of behavior. My little puppy Pixel, she's been shaped quite a bit, as you might imagine. And the idea is that, okay, I wanted her to sit pretty. Well, how do you sit pretty? Sitting pretty is sitting on your bum with your front paws dangling in the air. Cute with the just the paws kind of folded over and dangling and looking all cute like they're baking, right? So I call that sitting pretty. So sitting pretty. It took a little while. You had to get her to sit first. Okay, reinforce that in a particular discriminative stimulus in the presence of an SD, which was the words "sit pretty." I also have a visual SD for my dogs, or for my dog, which is a finger pointing in a particular direction, which indicates "sit pretty." So I use a visual and an auditory one SD at the same time. So she learns that okay, I had to sit when Ryan says sit pretty. So that was the first step. She got reinforced for that. The next step is, okay, now not only you have to do that, but you have to kind of rear up a little bit. You got to get your front paws off the ground. It's no longer acceptable it's no longer acceptable just to sit when I say sit pretty. You have to sit and sit up. And then the next step was to get those paws to hang the way they're supposed to, right? So once she engaged in that behavior and hung her paws just right, then I would reinforce it, and that's how you shape a behavior. Right? You can, that was a simple one, that 3-step sort of thing. The one I've kind of been working on now is a dance, right? So she stands all the way up on her hind legs, not sitting down, and then dances in a circle, right? Turns a circle. So that's the type of shaping. So ultimately, I'll get to that. Right? So again, lots of reinforcement early on. Allow the people to choose their own reinforcers if at all possible. Right? Vary the reinforcers. Right? And then you don't want them to habituate to a given reinforcer. Habituation to a reinforcer is basically an abolishing operation. If you've habituated to a reinforcer, it's no longer a valuable reinforcer. Right? Good job, good job, good job, good job, good job all the time is going to really devalue the idea of the words good job. And the kid's going to be like, whatever. I get that all the time. How about giving them a sticker once in a while? Good job. Hey, I think you deserve a sticker today. It never hurts to use the words good job, but you can always add in some other reinforcers. Right? So vary them. It makes it way, way, way more effective. And we could go into the research on varying reinforcers. In fact, might as well talk about it a little bit here for a second. We got time. The idea being, all right, let's look at habituation to reinforcers, some experiments that were done originally with rats and pigeons, and then the same researcher who discovered this stuff, Frances McSweeney down at WSU, she extended it into kids as well. And the basic history of the experiment goes like this. She found that the proportion of behavior engaging in a particular session, a 1-hour session, the majority of that behavior would happen shortly after the start of the session, and then the behavior would taper off throughout the session. In other words, it looks like the animal's kind of ramping up and then slowing down as the session goes on. And she tried to explain why, and ultimately she figured out through a lot of experiments, hundreds of them, that this was habituation to reinforcers, and that the organism was actually habituating. In other words, the establishing operations or the motivating operations were coming into play. Early on, it was the lack of access to the reinforcer had produced a motivating operation, and it maintained a lot of behavior. Towards the end of the session, it was because there had been so much access to the same reinforcer, it ended up as an abolishing operation, and it maintained less behavior. You decrease the frequency of the behavior, even within the session. So she went on and she tried this with kids, right? And so with kids, she was doing bites of hamburger. So bites of hamburger was the reinforcer. They had tasks they were supposed to engage in for a particular time. And with this bites of hamburger to a hungry kid, even bites of hamburger, it was great. It was working fine. It would maintain behavior. It was clearly a reinforcer. So it was functioning really well. But she also noticed that curve where the probability of, where the rate of responding started to decrease across the session. So in order to prove that it wasn't satiation or anything else, what did she do? She went through the first two-thirds of the session with the hamburger stuff, right? So the bites of hamburger was the reinforcer. Then she switched the reinforcer and made it a bite of a hot dog, and guess what? The rate of responding went through the roof, right back up to where it was with the highest rates of responding under the hamburger. So it wasn't food. It wasn't the fact that they were full. It was the fact that they had habituated to the reinforcer, right? So you changed the reinforcer a little bit, you got more behavior out of it. So varying reinforcers is a powerful thing. That's why you come up with a list, like we talked about earlier. Use the rank ordering procedure, the pre-task choice, all those types of things as well. Direct reinforcement, much better, right? There's two types of direct reinforcement. Well, I'm sorry. No, there's one type. I was just reading my slides wrong here. Automatic and natural. So you want it to be automatic and you want it to be a natural reinforcer. So the quicker you can come into contact with the real environment, the real reinforcer in the real environment, the more likely that is going to maintain behavior for a long period of time. A contrived reinforcer can be direct, right? So you got automatic and natural, and you have contrived, which is me giving you a reinforcer, like giving you the candy or giving you the toy or whatever it is for the appropriate behavior. But ultimately, you want homework, doing homework behavior, the behavior of doing your homework. You want that to come in contact with the natural reinforcer, which is learning the material, right? And being able to pass the test. So you want that automatic and natural if at all possible. Indirect reinforcement is extremely hard to generalize and extremely hard to maintain, as you might imagine. So we always want that to be, we want it to be immediate, as we talked about earlier, and we want it to be the behavior to be directly related to the reinforcer, not be related to another behavior, which is related to a different reinforcer. Okay, it gets really hard to sort of train somebody in that scenario. That stuff does happen. It's just it makes it very hard for training. Use discriminative stimuli to your advantage. Karen Pryor, the lady in your book, learned some really cool stuff. The lady that wrote the Don't Shoot the Dog book, she learned some really cool stuff about using discriminative stimuli and selecting for particular behavior. Let me give you the example here that she talked about. She may talk about it in her book, and I've read this thing in several places, but the basic idea is she had some, I think she was training dolphins at the time, and the idea was that the dolphins were engaging in some behavior that she didn't want. But remember, this is Karen Pryor, so she's not going to be using the punishment stuff. So the dolphins would actually swim to the bottom of the tank, all right, the bottom of their pool. Well, she couldn't work with them. Once they're at the bottom of the pool, there's nothing she can do, right? So they couldn't earn any reinforcers or anything like that. But the behavior, for whatever reason, seemed to be reinforcing for the dolphins. So she goes, bingo, she comes up with this idea. She goes, this behavior is here, so why not put the behavior under stimulus control? This is a natural behavior. There's some natural reinforcer for it. So then what she did was created a discriminative stimulus that basically said, if you swim to the bottom of the tank, you're going to get a reinforcer. And I'll be damned if it didn't work. Right? So the dolphins started to learn, swim to the bottom of the tank, get the reinforcer, and then what was really funny? The swimming to the bottom of the tank, not funny, but cool. The swimming to the bottom tank decreased at all other times unless the discriminative stimulus was present. So by using that discriminative stimulus, she was actually able to get the behavior under her control and not just the dolphins' control. Well, of course, the dolphins had some control. There's this whole thing called counter control, which we'll deal with later. But as a result, she was able to completely manage this response just by adding a discriminative stimulus, saying, it's okay to swim to the bottom of the tank if the little blue signal is up on the wall. My gosh. And, the dolphins learned it, and off they went, and they started doing their thing. And then she trained them to do the other stuff as well. SDs also think of rules. Use rules as an SD. It really helps access to reinforcer, especially for the automatic and natural stuff. If you can set up the rule properly, then you can get in touch with that reinforcer very quickly, and then it should just be pretty much automatic at that point. Early on, use continuous reinforcement. Every time the behavior happens, engage in a reinforcer. Somebody recently posted on my Facebook an example of what happens when you do this, and then you start to switch away from that, and it was quite humorous, and we'll talk about that later on when we start talking about extinction. But use continuous reinforcement initially. It's extremely effective to teach a new response, but later on you need to fade that out. You don't want to be reinforcing every single response. It's contrived. It's not realistic. You're not going to get a reinforcer for every single behavior you do in the real world. In fact, it's much to the opposite. You're not getting as many reinforcers as what you may think, but when you do get them, they do maintain a lot of behavior. Other stuff, increased delay to reinforcement. This is about teaching somebody, teaching a natural sort of setting, right? So if, switching from that contrived to the natural and or automatic setting. I engage in a behavior today, it's not necessarily going to produce a reinforcer today. It would be ideal if it would, as we know about with the immediate reinforcement stuff, but likely it's not going to. So we need to slowly start delaying the access to the reinforcer. So engage the behavior, you're going to get the reinforcer, but we're going to increase the delay. 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, a day, that type of thing. And then a lot of people use self-talk in the meantime to bridge that gap between the time they engage the behavior and the reinforcer. And saying that, ooh, okay, I did this response, I'm going to get a reinforcer for it later. Works pretty well. Contingent attention, providing access to attention, it's exactly like it sounds, reinforce the people with attention, essentially. Give you attention for engaging in the right behavior. Okay. Descriptive praise, if you're going to praise people, don't just say, hey, good job, say, good job for doing X. Okay. Especially with kids that are a little bit older that have some reasoning skills, then that'll make a lot of sense to them, and it really helps them. You're telling them exactly why you're reinforcing them, and what it was specifically that they did. Now, what that does for the kid, or the adult for that matter, is it teaches them that there was this one aspect of the behavior that led to reinforcement, not the whole thing. So it was being nice that led to the reinforcers. It was using my words in a particular way that led to the reinforcer, not just using my words. So that's where the descriptive praise can be useful. And of course, descriptive praise only works with people that already know how to follow the rules, because descriptive praise sets up a rule, right? And it says, okay, this is the behavior that got you a reinforcer. In other words, please engage in it again, right? In this scenario. All right, enough on those techniques. Let's jump into schedules. Right? We tend to put all these things together, right? We don't. It's not just one reinforcer, one reinforcer, one reinforcer. It's not always continuous. It's there's a schedule of them. You're not going to reinforce every single behavior. You're going to reinforce some behaviors, or you're going to reinforce every once in a while. Those types of things. So the backstory here is continuous reinforcement versus intermittent, and the real backstory actually came from an accident in the lab. Skinner screwed up. Serious. He buggered it up. I think it was Friday after. I think the story goes it was Friday afternoon, and Skinner was doing this was rats, pigeon stuff, and so he was working. I can't remember what he was. I think he was working with rats, and Friday afternoon he realized that he wasn't going to have enough pellets to get him through the weekend. Food pellets, right? He was using food pellets as a reinforcer for the rats. And at the time, he was doing continuous reinforcement stuff. Every behavior was getting a reinforcer, and he was teaching the rats to do all sorts of cool stuff. But he realized that, oh my gosh, it's Friday afternoon. The store is going to close X amount of time. I'm not going to have enough time to go to the store to get the ingredients I need to make the food pellets in order to get me through the weekend. So he did the math, and he realized, well, if I just went every other behavior, reinforced every other behavior, then I would. Oh, excuse me, I've got the yawns today. I'm not even tired. Anyway, and he goes, if I just reinforce every other behavior, I wonder what would happen. I've got enough pellets to get me through the weekend. If I do that, I don't know what's going to happen to behavior, but I'll give it a shot. You know what happened? More behavior. Basically, ultimately, he found that you can maintain more behavior through intermittent reinforcement, in other words, not reinforcing every single response, than if you do reinforce every response. In reality, the later story that came out and the later understanding that we have of this was that it wasn't just more behavior, it was really resistance to extinction. So we'll talk about resistance to extinction here in a second. So we got two general categories for reinforcement schedules, and we break each of those categories into two subcategories as well. So we have ratio schedules. Ratio schedules are basic, they're really straightforward. It really means that you engage in X numbers of responses, you're going to get a reinforcer. We have two types. Fixed ratio, so an FR, let's say an FR5. An FR5 means you engage in 5 responses, you will earn your reinforcer. 5 more responses, earn your reinforcer. 5 more responses, earn your reinforcer. 5 more, so on and so forth. Okay, what this tends to produce is a stepped effect. Right? So the fixed ratio is you start the ratio run, as you say. Right? So I start doing my behaviors and I work and I get all 5 of my tasks done, and they're all the same behavior usually. So I engage in that behavior 5 times and I earn the reinforcer for it. Then you tend to take a break. It's called a post-reinforcement pause. Right? So that post-reinforcement pause, right, happens after you get the reinforcer, and the reinforcer happens when you complete the ratio run. So the ratio run is a high rate of behavior, and you earn your reinforcer. You tend to take a break before you start the next one. Interestingly, before you start the next ratio run to earn your next reinforcer for the next 5 behaviors. Interestingly enough, there's some challenge to the argument that this is actually a post-reinforcer pause. There's some evidence that indicates that this is a procrastination pause and not a post-reinforcer one. What's the evidence? Well, it's really straightforward. The pause starts the session. When you put somebody on a fixed ratio schedule, or you put an animal on a fixed ratio schedule, they actually start with a pause. They don't immediately start pressing the lever or doing the task, whatever it is. Oftentimes at work, think about it when you get to work, or think about it when you're doing an assignment. You don't get right into work and work really hard the very first moment that you start doing your stuff. You get a dilly-dally for a few minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, an hour in some cases, and then you start your work. Right? So that pause initially, right, is either called a procrastination pause, and that's what some people are starting to call it nowadays. And historically we've called it a post-reinforcer pause because it happens after the reinforcer. But again, some people are arguing that it's procrastination. So once you procrastinate for a while, then once you start, you tend to complete, and then you take another pause. In other words, you procrastinate until you start again. Right? So it fits the data really well both ways, and it tends to explain a little more behavior if we think of it as a procrastination pause. And it really fits when we think about school behavior, because think of writing a paper, for example. Historically, what happens with a paper is that you pause. In other words, you procrastinate, but once you start it, you tend to complete it. So it acts like a fixed ratio schedule. So, and it may be a fixed ratio, 5 pages, 500 words, whatever, before you earn your reinforcer. So that's fixed ratio. Variable ratio. Now, this is a little different, right? In that it's going to be an average number of responses. So if we're going a variable ratio of 5, we're saying that on average, every 5th response is going to be reinforced. Sometimes it'll be the first response, sometimes it'll be the 10th response, but on average, it's going to be every 5. So this is a long-term sort of schedule, and what do you see with it? You see a very strong, steady rate of responding. No step, no pauses, none of that stuff. Just strong and steady. Basically, they never know when the reinforcer's coming. Okay? Sometimes it's now, sometimes after 1 response, sometimes it's after 10 responses, but you never know when it's coming. It becomes quite resistant to extinction because you don't know when the reinforcer's coming. And remember, extinction is withholding reinforcement for a given behavior. So with a variable ratio schedule, you actually have extinction built in. So as you go along, you're engaging in a particular behavior, but you might not be reinforced for it. That's an instance of extinction. But if you're on a variable ratio schedule, you will be very resistant to extinction because sometimes it's 1 behavior, sometimes it's 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm engaging in 5 behaviors and I haven't been a reinforcer. You hit the 6th behavior, boom, reinforced. Wow, all right. The organism, the person, the kid learns, sometimes I've got to work hard in order to get my reinforcer. Sometimes I've got to put out quite a bit of effort in order to earn it. Right? And you're not just going to get reinforced for every little thing you do. Right? Okay, so those are the ratio schedules. They're based on the numbers of responses. The interval schedules are based on time, time plus responses. So you have a fixed interval. Okay? A fixed interval is an example of, or a good example of a fixed interval is the schedule that you see on the right here, supposedly. Assuming they all say on time, which they don't. But anyway, I just always find that ironic that you've got this you got this thing up here. Here's an on time one. Here's a adjusted time one, so that one's delayed. This one's delayed. This one's delayed. This one's delayed. This one's on time. It just kind of cracks me up that that's the case, that there's so many delayed ones. Anyway, so the idea with a fixed interval is assuming all these were on time, we would have a good example of a fixed interval. At 7 p.m., the first response is going to be reinforced. So if you are on the bus, or you're there waiting for the bus, at 7 p.m. you will be reinforced by being able to get on the bus. Okay, So fixed interval. First response after a given amount of time has passed will be reinforced, and this just continues on. So an FI 20 is every 20 minutes a response is going to be reinforced. So the first response. So it doesn't matter what you do. If you're really good at timing, you only need to make one response. Right? So every 20 minutes, the next response is going to be reinforced. Technically, you only need to do something once every 20 minutes. Checking the mail is a great example. If you get mail every single day at the same time, every single day, and you always have to get mail in order for it to be a fixed interval, and it always has to come at the exact same time, then you're on an FI 24 hour. One response every day will get you a reinforcer. Right? And the reinforcer will be, so the response is checking the mailbox, the reinforcer is you get mail. Even junk mail is a reinforcer. Why? Because you check the mail and you got the junk out of it. Right? So the idea is that it's on an interval. If I think about checking my mailbox at school, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I go there all the time, but there's not always stuff in it. It's not a fixed interval then. It's probably a variable interval. Variable interval meaning that on average, every day, I'm going to get something in my box at school. Sometimes I don't get anything. Other times I get a whole bunch of stuff. So I end up, and most of us do, checking our box multiple times per day because we never really know when the reinforcer is going to come in. Right? We never really know when that VI is, when the next response is going to be reinforced. So if we go back a little bit here, fixed intervals, just like a fixed ratio, produce a very clear effect. And it's not stepped. This one's a scallop. So it's kind of an accelerating behavior as it gets closer to the time. So think about looking for the bus. You're standing out there waiting for the bus. You know it's supposed to be there at 8:32. So at 8:31, you start looking up for it. At 8:31 and a half, you look up for it again. 8:34, 8:31 and 3/4 or 45 seconds, you're going to look up again, and so on and so forth. You just keep looking. You look more and more frequently. So you're accelerating your behavior, and then all of a sudden the bus shows up. Bingo, you get your reinforcer for getting on the bus. Right? So that's that. Accelerating sort of effect. As soon as you get on the bus, or as soon as the bus passes, whatever the case is, however you want to look at this example, then you take a slight post-reinforcer pause, and you tend to accelerate. So it's a scalloped effect. Right? Fairly strong, steady rates of responding. They accelerate, and then they take a break, and they accelerate, and they take a break, and they accelerate, and they take a break. Right? Variable interval, strong, steady rates of responding, and similar to variable ratio schedules. You can throw in limited holds on these things. Limited hold basically means it's tied in with an interval schedule, and it just simply means that a reinforcer is going to be made available for a certain amount of time. So you've completed your interval, but the reinforcer is only available for the next 30 seconds. Just think about McDonald's breakfast. 6 a.m. or whatever it is, I'm going to say 6 to 10. I don't know if that's really what it is. I think it's 6 to 10:30. Anyway, 6 a.m. to 10:30. So it's a 24-hour. It's a fixed interval. It's it's an FI 24 hour, so fixed interval 24 hour, with a 4.5 hour limited hold. Why? Because that first response is only available for 4.5 hours after that 24 hour period. Okay. If you wait even 4 hours and 31 minutes, the window is shut and you cannot order breakfast. It's done. You're over, and you guys have all seen the YouTube videos where people flip out and punch the people and scream and yell and bang on the glass and get really pissed off. Well, guess what? That's extinction. And that's the frustration, that's the aggression that gets produced when you go on extinction. Right? So again, the limited hold is that breakfast is only available for a certain amount of time. With kids, we can do, in the classroom, we can do this by saying, all right, at 11 o'clock, you're going to be able to engage in this particular behavior, but you can only do it for 10 minutes. You've only got a 10-minute window to turn your assignment in or something like that. And that becomes a limited hold. Duration schedules, those are about engaging in behavior for a given amount of time in order to earn the reinforcer. I've used duration schedules on myself. Engage in homework, engage in studying behavior for an hour, and I can get 5 minutes access to another reinforcer. And or another behavior, which would be a reinforcer, because I would use Premax. So I would do study for 1 hour, get 5 minutes access to working on my old truck that I used to have. Right? And slowly but surely, I was able to build up that darn truck, and it worked. It strengthened the behavior of studying. So I would always study and reinforce myself with access to the truck. Okay? But I could change that time. First off, it started off as, okay, study for an hour. Then it started off as study for an hour and a half for 10 minutes access. Then study for 2 hours for 10 minutes access. Then 3 hours for 10 minutes access. And that's about as far as I took it. Right? Because I didn't really want to create that strain. I didn't want to ratio strain or whatever you want to call it. All right, there's even other variations on these schedules. They basically take these schedules and then you can tweak them. Right? So differential reinforcement, so DR stands for differential reinforcement. So in other words, you're going to only reinforce in certain scenarios. So DRH, differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior. This is what's happened to a vast majority of people with smartphones. They're on a DRH schedule. They're reinforced for checking their phones all the time. Why? Because there's always a reinforcer there available for them, right? So it's a DRH. So you engage in high rates of behavior. In the classroom, we would set this up in a different scenario where you have to answer 7 problems in the next 10 minutes, otherwise you don't earn the reinforcer. If you answer 6 problems in the next 10 minutes, no reinforcer. Think about speaking and fluency. We're talking about DRHs. Engage in behavior at a particular rate, at a minimum rate, in order to earn the reinforcer. Okay? So you have to speak X numbers of words per minute accurately in order to earn the reinforcer. Right? A DRL is kind of the other side of this, right? Differential reinforcement of low rates. I will allow you to speak out of turn, but as long as you only do it once or twice an hour, then you'll get the reinforcer. In other words, it'll be a negative reinforcer. You'll avoid going to timeout, or you will avoid getting in trouble. Right? And then we can look at DR of diminishing rates. And so this is where you change the criteria as you go, and I've used the term changing criteria in design in the past. You would use a DRD to do a change in criterion design. So the idea is that if you're engaging in a particular behavior at a high rate, let's say talking out of turn, now I'm going to have you drop that down a notch and say, okay, now you're going to talk out of, you can talk out of turn, but not as much as what you did yesterday, and the next day is, okay, you can talk out of turn, but not as much as you did the day before, and so on and so forth. You're diminishing that rate, you're reducing that rate. We'll talk more about these later, but the basic idea is that you're using reinforcement to slow down a response here. So a particular rate of responding is what's being reinforced, not just that behavior. Progressive schedules, okay, thin the reinforcement delivery automatically. Right? So we're going to start to thin out those reinforcers. You're going to have to work harder and harder and harder and harder for the reinforcer as time goes on. Early on, maybe it was 5 responses, and then now it's 10, now it's 20. Now you got to write an entire chapter, that type of thing, right, before you get the reinforcer. So those are progressive schedules. These get even more complex. So concurrent schedules, the complex schedules page here, this is more about how we really behave, how we behave in the real world, because all these little schedules up above combine to make our life. So concurrent schedules, 2 or more contingencies, 2 or more behaviors, they're happening at the same time. I can choose to go to Zahan, or I can choose to go to Biani. Okay, I can choose either one of those. Right? So one of them is going to give me one reinforcer, another one's going to give me a different reinforcer. Right? So 2 or more contingencies. Well, it's going to take me a little longer to get to one place than it will to get to the other place. So you get the idea here. Okay, I can engage in going outside and playing baseball right now, or I can engage in recording a lecture for you guys. So 2 or more behaviors, 2 or more contingencies, there's all sorts of different reinforcers that are available for each. They're happening at the same time. This is how we study choice. If you bring choice into the lab, this is what you do. In order to, which would you rather engage in? So you give an opportunity for the person, the organism, whatever, to engage in a particular behavior or another behavior and see what they choose. And you can, as you vary the amounts of reinforcements for those, for the varying behaviors, you can force the choice to one way or force it back to the other. You can bounce it back and forth. This is what I'm getting at here. Is you're really coming up with the matching law, which is that you will choose to do the behavior that gets you the most reinforcer at the given moment, or in a given time. So if I make it more reinforcing for you to engage in doing your homework, then you'll do it versus going outside and playing with your friends. But if I make playing with your friends more reinforcing, then you'll do that over choosing your homework. So you get the idea, and some of this comes down to some self-management stuff and access to long-term reinforcers. But don't forget, short-term wins out over long-term, so it's really hard to teach some of these things to get people to do the right thing in the right scenario. Competition is, these 2 schedules are competing with each other oftentimes, and we can go on. You can kind of get at what I was getting at a minute ago with regard to the competing reinforcers and which one's going to win. Well, the one that's going to win is the one that gets you the most reinforcement. Or the schedule that you're going to spend more time on is the one that's going to give you more reinforcement. Alternative schedules to the intervals and ratios. There's all sorts of these things. You can reach either to receive a reinforcer. The idea meaning you can choose this one or this one. Both of them will get you the reinforcer. Which one would you prefer? It's a type of concurrent schedule essentially. So reach either one of them, and you're going to end up with a reinforcer. There's even more complex schedules out there than this. There's concurrent schedules, as I've already talked about. There's change schedules, where you got to complete one schedule before you get access to the second schedule, before you get access to the third, before you earn your reinforcer for everything. There's some of those that are signaled and some of them that are not, so you don't know when you're behaving in under one schedule, and you go to a new schedule and you're behaving under a different one, in other words, and so on. It gets very complex, right? But that's how the real world works. We don't always know which schedule of reinforcement we're on. We know that there's schedules out there, but to be able to identify what those schedules are is brutal, right? And what the reinforcement rates are for any given behavior. But this is what leads to gambling, right? I mean, gambling is in a nutshell a complex schedule. It's where you take all those things that we talked about above, fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable interval, and put them all together all at the same time, but don't signal to anybody which one's happening. The end result, you press the button a whole bunch of times. And sometimes we call that addicted. Basically, it just means you're operating under the appropriate contingency. If you're feeding that money, if you're feeding that machine a whole bunch of money, you're operating under the contingency that has been selected for. In other words, you're giving the casino your money because they have put you under a schedule that basically means you will. Sometimes, basically means you will give them all of your money. Sometimes you'll engage in a particular bit. You'll engage in the lever press or the press of the button on the slot machine. You get reinforced right away and you're done. Right? Because that's that whole variable part, right? Variable ratio, variable interval. You never know. They're all running at the same time. Other times you press the button 8 million times, you don't get anything. Okay? So where do motivating operations come in? Do I have a lot of money to spend? Do I not have a lot of money to spend? Right? If I've only got $10, if my account's really low, then my motivating operation to gamble, I'm probably not going to gamble that long, right? Because I'm not going to be very resistant to extinction. I don't have many reinforcers to deal with, to play with here. I don't have much money to play with. So it becomes a motivating operation. So anyway, you can get the idea about putting all these things together into the real world, and it gets quite complex. So in the classroom or when we're working with kids, we try to tease these apart and set them up in a way that allows us to work with them. But then we always try to get these things back out into the natural environment and fade our contrived schedule out. But those are the basic schedules. There's a few more in your book, so make sure you're aware of them. Talk to you later.